Okay, so let's first discuss the test and the answers here. So I bought a new house last year, right? But I haven't sold my old house yet, right? So we've got the keywords, the key expressions, time reference, specific time reference, and yet, right? So at the moment I've got two houses because I haven't sold my old house yet, right? So this is obviously connected to the present. When Anne was on her way to the station, it began to rain, right? Obviously this is narration, right? It's about it might be part of a story, and we are talking about two events in the past. When something happened, something else happened. When is one of those words that would usually indicate a past tense, past simple, past continuous, not present perfect. Mary in Japan for 2 years, right? And we know that she's working there and likes it very much, so she's still in Japan. That's why she has been in Japan for 2 years. She's working there and likes it very much. How? And now we are asking about the specifics of her trip there, right? So how did she go, right? Because we are referring to that moment in the past, that specific event, her journey to Japan. She went by air, of course. So even although the time is not specified explicitly, still we know that we are referring to that event in the past, and this is obviously not connected with the present. So here we have a story, right, or a situation in the past. Peter tried to come in quietly, but his mother heard him and called out. And this is what the mother said, right? Where have you been? Right? Until now, basically. Your supper has been in the oven for an hour, right? So it's still there, right? Have you been to Cambridge? Right? We're asking about experience. It doesn't matter when. In general, have you visited that place? Yes, I went there last weekend, obviously. How did you get there? So we're asking about the specifics, right, of that trip, of that journey. My brother took me in his car, right? So it's all about this journey in the past. Tom left the house at 8 p.m., right, in the past. So we're specifying the time at 8 p.m. and nobody has seen him since then, right? So he's still not to be found, right? Probably even now nobody knows where he is. Okay, the first question is a general question, right? In other words, we want to ask, is your homework ready, right? So have you written your homework? That's all we want to know. We don't care when, right? But the second sentence, of course, specifies the time here, right? So your brother finished an hour ago. The next question, again, this is a question about what matters here is whether you have heard the news, right? So have you heard the news? I just want to know if you are aware of the news or if you know the news. Mary has just had a baby, right? Number 9 is about experience again, right? So I have seen this film twice. I don't want to see it again. Yeah, what's important is the fact that I've seen this film twice. I'm not saying when I saw the film. And finally, I haven't seen Jerry for a long time, right? So for a long time, until now, right? How is he? Okay, and the second one, present perfect simple or continuous. So someone has eaten all the cakes. I'll have to buy some more. So in other words, there are no cakes, right? So that's the result of the fact that someone has eaten them, right? And we say all the cakes, so this is completed, right? So that's why present perfect simple. My throat is really sore. I have been singing. So here the focus is on the continuity, right? All evening, right? Until now I've been singing, and maybe I'll continue singing for some time. Those two cats have been sitting on that branch for the last hour, right? Sit is one of those verbs, if you refer to Thompson and Martinet, the thick book, it's one of those verbs that is commonly used in the continuous, in the present perfect continuous, because it's usually a process, right? Sitting is like a continuous process. And we've got for the last hour, and also they're probably still sitting there, right? We can see the two cats, they are sitting on that branch, and they have been sitting there for the last hour. So here this continuity is important. How many people? And the ideal answer is, have you invited? Of course, we don't have the whole context, but if we ask in general, we just want to know how many people are invited, right? So we are interested in the result, right? So that's why present perfect. Why present perfect simple? Because obviously we are this was a single event, or at least each person was invited individually, and we are also asking about the number of people, right? So even if there were many invitations, they were individual events, not a continuous event. Okay, and I have been phoning Anne all evening, but there is no reply. All evening, right? So I've been doing this, so I'm focusing, or I'm emphasizing the continuity again, right? I'm not focusing on the individual calls. I'm not saying I have phoned Anne 5 times, right? That would be present perfect. I'm saying I've been phoning her all evening. So the important thing is this continuity. And finally, I have met him twice, right? So twice. We specify the number of times. So obviously we can only use the present perfect simple, right? So that's the test. Okay, so let's talk about the past perfect. So you were supposed to read this overview and do a few tasks, but let's quickly look at those forms and uses again. So of course the form is quite similar to present perfect, except that instead of have or has, we use the past form had for the auxiliary. Right? So had I worked, had he eaten, I hadn't worked, I had worked, and of course we use the contraction I'd, he'd, we'd, and so on, which of course looks exactly like the contraction for would, but in context we can recognize this as past perfect because the past participle used here. So when we talk about the uses, the past perfect is a tense that is used for events which happened before other events in the past, right? Especially when there is no time expression to make this clear. The later event is denoted by past simple or past continuous. So for example, by the time we got to the bus stop, the bus had left, right? So of course this is the main event we are focusing on, and then relative to that event something else had happened earlier, right? And by the time is one of those expressions commonly used with past perfect. By the time, or by plus a specific time expression, like by 10 o'clock, by that time, by the evening, and so on. She was sleeping soundly. She had worked the whole night. So here we have no time. No expressions like by or when. We just have two independent sentences, but here obviously we are talking about a situation in the past, and then relative to the situation something else had happened earlier, and in this case it's obvious that this is the cause or the reason for this, right? So something had happened, and that's why she was sleeping soundly, right? So we could say she was sleeping soundly because she had worked the whole night. So obviously this had happened earlier, and this was the reason for this event. He was 23 when I met him. His mother had died 2 years before. Before is another word that is commonly used with past perfect. Because it refers again to some event in the past before which something else had happened, right? He was 23 when I met him. His mother had died 2 years before that moment, right? Okay, so we use the past perfect when we are talking about a specific moment in the past, and then relative to that time or that moment, something else had happened, which maybe caused this situation or is somehow connected with the situation. But if we merely give the events in the order in which they occurred, there is no need for past perfect. So, for example, in storytelling, if we just report the events one by one, there is no need at all to use the past perfect. She worked the whole night, then she got home and went to bed, right? So we have events happening one after another. So we are moving in time, but we are not moving back. We are not referring to any earlier events. So in order to use past perfect, we need to look back from the viewpoint of a moment in the past. The past perfect can also be used like present perfect, but when we talk about a past situation, so it's a past equivalent of present perfect in that sense, right? So you can compare these sentences where we are talking about a present situation and a past situation. So in the present, we can say he has just left. Maybe I'll be able to catch him. So, of course, this is something connected with the present, a recent event, right? In the past, we can say, when I arrived, he had just left, right? So here, we are talking about a past event or a past situation. When I arrived, right? So at that moment, he had just left, which means it's a recent event in the past. That happened just before I arrived, right? Or in the present, we can say it's 6 o'clock now. I've been here for 2 hours, right? So you know this use, right? You've got for or since to talk about something which started in the past and continues until the present moment, or has just finished. So, so this is a typical use of for the present perfect. In the past, we can say basically the same. We can say it was 6 o'clock. I'd been there for 2 hours, right? So it was 6 o'clock, and until that time, I had been there for 2 hours, right? Here, of course, we have there and not here, because probably we are now in a different place, right? So it's not connected to the present. Or the glass is empty. Somebody has drunk my juice. So we have a result, right? The glass is empty because somebody has drunk my juice. Or I conclude that somebody has drunk my juice. In the past, we could say something similar. The glass was empty. Somebody had drunk my juice, right? So I saw that the glass was empty because somebody had drunk my juice. And that was the result, right? Okay, so we often use the past perfect in reported speech because if you know anything about reported speech in the past, we often have to change the tenses, right? So when we use words, verbs like realize, remember, know, understand, or even say in the past, and then we report something, then we have to change the tense, right? So, for example, he is here. I didn't know he was here, right? So in Polish we would translate this as nie wiedziałem, że tu jest, right? So we would translate this into the present because it's about the present. But because we start with I didn't know, we have to change the tense. So what if we want to say nie wiedziałem, że go nie było? Right? We would say I didn't know he hadn't been there, right? So we would have to change the tense to indicate that we're talking about the past. So in this situation here, when I arrived home, I realized I had left my wallet in the taxi, right? So because we say I realized, and it's all in the past, right? The situation is in the past. When I arrived home, I realized what? That I had left my wallet in the taxi, right? We can't just leave the past here because if we said I realized I left, in this situation maybe we would be understood, but very often this would be understood as a present situation, right? Like I realized I had no money, right? So zdałem sobie sprawę, że nie mam pieniędzy, right? But in English, because this is in the past, we have to use the past, right? To talk about something that happened at the same time, right? But if it happened earlier, we have to use the past perfect, right? So if you think about it, it's quite logical, right? I realized something that had happened earlier, right? I didn't realize something that happened at the same time. I hope that makes sense. And the last point is quite tricky. So we use the past perfect to emphasize the completion of an action when used with words like till, until, and before. And here the past simple action may actually precede the past perfect action. And with the word before, it always does, right? It may actually precede or happen earlier than the past perfect action, which logically doesn't seem to make sense. But here past perfect is used to just emphasize the completion of an action. So for example, he didn't wait till we had finished our meal, right? So obviously in this situation he didn't wait, right? So what happened earlier, right? Basically we say he didn't wait, so he waited only for some time, right? Or the not waiting happened before we finished the meal, right? But he didn't wait till we actually completed our meal, right? Or she grabbed my plate before I had finished eating, right? So what happened first? Of course, she grabbed my plate and I didn't even manage to finish eating, right? So that's basically what it means. These may sound a little tricky, but it's just a question of practice and being exposed to this. So I encourage you to read these sections in the book, right? In the theory book, sections 194 and 195, because they contain some detailed. So the past perfect continuous. The past perfect continuous is the past equivalent of present perfect continuous. So it's used in the same situations that you would use present perfect continuous when talking about the present situation, except that we're talking about the past. So if you remember, when the present perfect continuous is used, like an action which began in the past and is still continuing, the past perfect continuous would be used for a situation which began before some past moment or past action and was still continuing, right? So I've been working here since last summer. The past perfect equivalent would be I had been working there since the previous summer, for example. It depends on the situation. But of course, this refers to some other past action or past moment, right? So if you look at all these uses, when you just put those situations in the past, you can use, or you would use, the past perfect continuous, right? So if you look at this sentence, I'm tired. I've been writing emails since morning. So you can imagine this situation in the past, and you could say, well, I was tired. I had been writing emails since morning, right? Yes, so you can apply this to any of these situations. I've been reading that book you gave me, right? I told him I had been reading that book he had given me, right? So you would change this into the past perfect continuous, and of course you would change this into the past perfect. To explain a present situation, so you would use the past perfect continuous to explain a past situation, right? So something caused a situation in the past. I've been swimming. That's why I'm all wet. I'd been swimming. Right? I had been swimming. That's why I was all wet. Right? In the past. The room was a complete mess. And of course, we wouldn't ask this kind of question because that was in the past. So depending on the context, you would have to rephrase this somehow. But you could say, for example, the room was in a complete mess. I wonder what on earth he had been doing. Or I wondered what on earth he had been doing. And the same here, right? I was really annoyed. She had been calling me all day. Right? So that's how it's used. If you look at these examples, he looked at the clock. It was 12 noon. He had been sleeping for 11 hours. Right? So in the present, you could say, well, it's 12 noon. I have been sleeping for 11 hours. Right? In the present. But in the past, it was 12 noon. He had been sleeping for 11 hours. He didn't know where she was. He had been trying to reach her on the phone since the previous night with no success. Right? So he didn't know where she was in the past. But you could say in the present, well, I don't know where she is. I've been trying to reach her on the phone since last night with no success. Right? So it's okay, so let's talk a little bit more about past perfect. So I'm going to show you a few examples of sentences and talk about the differences between them. So the sentences are available in documents, classes, and you have this file here, or you can just go to course progress. So show course planning, and for this week you've got the resources, example sentences. After clicking on this, you should see a file which has been downloaded. Right? So you can see the sentences here. When he entered the room, she left. When he entered the room, she was leaving. When he entered the room, she had left. Right? So we can see three similar sentences, but of course the situation in each sentence is quite different. Right? So the first sentence indicates just a series of events. Right? So when he entered the room, she left. So he entered the room and she left. Maybe because she saw him or for whatever reason. Right? So obviously this happened first, this happened after that. When he entered the room, she was leaving. Right? So in this case, if you remember when the past continuous is used, this means that when he entered the room, she was already leaving. She was in the process of leaving. Right? So maybe he met her in the doorway. Right? She passed him while he was entering the room. Right? This is the continuous action, and this is the action that interrupted this continuous action, or happened while this was happening. Right? When he entered the room, she had left. So what does that mean? So you can see that by using just a tense with no need for any words like after or before, we can indicate that when he entered the room, she was no longer there, right? So when he entered the room, he saw that she was no longer there. He saw that she had left, right? Of course, we could use other conjunctions here, like by the time he entered the room, or before. Yeah, but we don't even need to use before, right? Because it's obvious that this happened earlier. Let's look at 4 sentences that use 4 different tenses. So that's, as you can see, past simple, past continuous, past perfect simple, and past perfect continuous. So let's see how they make the situation different. Of course, in this case, in each sentence, the situation or the context is slightly different. And even the verbs are different. But you can see that something happened when the police arrived. And the question is, when did it happen and how did it happen? Right? So if I say, let's imagine that I'm a criminal, right? Or a person who the police are after, right? So definitely I don't want to meet them, or I have some aggressive tendencies. So in each of these cases, something happens or happened when the police arrived. Maybe I shouldn't use the past simple because that already indicates, well, that's already past simple, right? So let's look at the first sentence. When the police arrived, I jumped out of the window. And this is pretty straightforward, and I think it's pretty obvious. The police arrived, and I jumped out of the window, right, after they arrived. So probably because they arrived, and I wanted to escape. Right? When the police arrived, I was standing on the windowsill, right? So in this situation, obviously, their arrival happened during or while I was standing on the windowsill. So maybe it interrupted it, or obviously my standing on the windowsill was the continuous action, right? So I was already standing on the windowsill, and we don't know what happened later, right? Maybe I jumped, so maybe that's just the same situation but from a different perspective. When the police arrived, I had already left the flat through the window, right? So that's an entirely different situation, because that means that when they arrived, I was no longer there, right? Because I had already left, right? And finally, when the police arrived, I had been waiting for them with a gun, right? So I don't recommend doing this, but in this particular situation, of course, this focuses on something happening up to that point when the police arrived, right? So of course it's a continuous action that was, or that had been happening until the moment the police arrived, right? So obviously that's like using present perfect continuous, but we're talking about the past, right? So something had been happening not until now, but until that moment that the police arrived. Of course, we could also add a time expression. I'd been waiting for them for half an hour. So let's talk about other forms referring to the past. So two of the most common such forms are used to and would. So both of these forms refer to past habits, and there are slight differences between them, which we'll talk about. although in many respects they're similar. If you look at the forms, used to is used just like a past form of use, right? So you would say, I used to work. I didn't used to work. Did I used to work? And of course the short answer would be yes, I did, or no, I didn't. So this form must not be confused with to be used to something, or to be used to doing something, which has a slightly different meaning. So we are not talking about that form, right? We are talking about used to, not be used to. So I used to, not I'm used to something, right? So I used to do something. So this form is used to describe past habits, especially when contrasting them with the present. For example, I used to like chess, but now I don't have the time, right? So usually this form means that we did something or used to do something, but we no longer do it. Or the other way around, we didn't used to do something, but we do it now, right? So it's a habit in the past which we no longer have, or maybe a habit that we didn't used to have, but now we do. So another example is, we used to go out to the pub every weekend, but it's a long time since I last went. Right? So again, it's something I used to do, or we used to do regularly, but we haven't in a long time. Didn't you used to sing in a choir? We can ask someone, right? So wasn't there a time when you sang in a choir? Everybody used to believe in Santa Claus, right? So that's what everybody or most people used to believe, but obviously they no longer do. Okay, so let's talk about would. So would is used to describe past habits as well, but it cannot be used with states. And it is usually used in literary texts, which is perhaps not strictly true. By literary, we mean like in narration, for example, right? So it doesn't have to be, literature per se. But it's not very colloquial, perhaps. So, for example, Tom would often go to the woods to stay alone for a while, right? So you can see that this is a repeated action in the past, a regular habit. That's why you cannot say everybody would believe in Santa Claus, because believing is a state, right? It's not an action. So would is used with some repeated actions in the past, something we would or used to do. So this means that we can use used to instead of would in many situations, right? Because used to is more general. It can be used for both actions and states. But we cannot use would instead of used to in many situations, like here. Of course, in order to really understand how these forms are used, you need practice and exposure.